Hello everyone and welcome back to Hubbub Explores. Today we're going to be talking all about food. So basically we at Hubbub have been holding some online webinars with different businesses and organisations to find out how we've been coping in COVID and what might change when we come out of lockdown. This crisis has already transformed the way that we buy and consume food. And we've conducted some public polling into the shifting attitudes around food, the results of which we're going to chat through in this. But first off, I'm going to go and speak to David, who's here with us from Western Farms, to talk about how the crisis has affected his local farm shop and what he's been doing to help feed his community.
Okay, so hello again. And just to take you through, so somebody who's a farmer and a food retailer as well. We've got our own large farm shop. And as a farmer, I've always encouraged people to buy more of my food, to buy British food, and been really positive about food. And I never thought I would find myself in a position where I would be telling people they couldn't have food, that we didn't have enough for them, I was having to ration to it, that I was having to say no to people. That was a really sharp memory for me. And I'm sure it was for my customers too. And I'm sure those memories will have lasting impact. Those 4 days in early lockdown when supply chains ran out of food, and then we found ourselves as one of the few places in our area that still had food. And that will have an impact, and it should have an impact on policy going forwards. But there was a lot of positive too. From the lockdown period, people had time, and they used that time to cook at home, to engage with real food, to cook as a family. And for many, it's the first time they've done such things either ever or in decades. They found it a really positive experience, engaging with real food. I've had so many conversations with people where I come to the shop, seen real food and what it's really like, bought it, taken it home, cooked it together and eaten it, and just really enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. So I think that's a really, really positive thing to come out of coronavirus. The other thing that really stood out through this period for us was how well our local supply chains worked. The people that supply my shop are all people I know well. I've had relationships with them for many, many years. They're all good friends. Many of them are local farmers too, and they work really hard day and night to keep the food coming, to supply us the food we needed when everywhere else has run out. So our baker, our butcher, the dairy we use, those basic foodstuffs, they work night and day, but they were able to keep us supplied. There wasn't a problem. We never ran out of any major food stuff, and that was an incredible experience, and it worked really well. It was just a question of feeding people through the shop in a socially distanced way, but it wasn't about supply. So we learnt other than some of the most extreme conditions, that local supply chains are resilient, they're short, they're effective, and they can deliver. And that's something, I think, a lesson we need to learn as well. Big isn't always beautiful, and it does have something to offer. So look, I hope that gives you a feel of how coronavirus has been for us as a farmer and a retailer and what it has to offer.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I wonder whether you think that this is, going to their smaller local businesses is something that people are going to carry on doing even after lockdown is over.
I think it will. Of course, people are going to get busy again. Of course, they're going to go back to their busy lives. But I've had so many conversations with so many customers who've enjoyed this time. They've enjoyed having the time to eat as a family, cook as a family. They've enjoyed engaging with real food. And those are lessons they won't lose. You know, we've got to be realistic that, of course, you know, for many people, eventually a normal life will resume, but it isn't returning anytime soon. And they will still have time over the coming months, years, whatever it's going to be, to actually remember those memories and keep that experience of real food going.
Absolutely. I think more and more people are discovering all sorts of things. I know in this house we've never baked a loaf of bread before, and suddenly in lockdown it all we seem to be doing. So I think people are really trying.
Well, the only yeast we could get during lockdown was fresh yeast from a baker. We couldn't get dried yeast at all. And so we were selling fresh yeast, and everybody's like, well, what do we do with fresh yeast? And we had a sort of handy guide on how to use fresh yeast. But of course now they've all learned that fresh yeast is actually really good. It works better than dried yeast, and you get a better loaf. So now they're all asking, now we can get dried yeast. They don't want it. They want to stick with fresh yeast, and that just gives you an example.
Absolutely. And can you see after this a kind of rise in the smaller business, the local supply chain, and that taking more of a forefront in how we get our food?
Yes, it can, and it should, because it has a lot to offer. And big, as I think I said, isn't always beautiful. But it does have to understand what it has to offer. It mustn't be expensive, and it must have availability. You still got to give the customer what they want. So yes, it can, and yes, it should, and yes, it will. But it also has lessons to learn about how it can do it in a way that makes it as accessible as possible for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people are looking, maybe they don't live near their local farm shop, but they do want to support local businesses, what advice might you have for them?
So there's lots of ways. So there's been an absolute, there's lots of online offerings have popped up in the last few weeks, and they can and still should continue. So if you're in an area where, yes, you can't access a local food shop or a farm shop or a direct supplier, find it online. They're all there, and they're all supplying the same products I do. Use them because it's the same thing, and it just makes it easier to get.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for speaking to us, and I hope you have a lovely day.
That's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
So I'm here with Anna Taylor from the Food Foundation, who's kindly agreed to come and speak to us today. You also joined us last week for one of our Hubbub Explores workshops. Hi, Anna, thank you for joining us.
Hi.
I wonder if you could just give us a quick overview of what you talked about in Hubbub Explores.
Yeah, sure. So I talked a bit about the work that we've been doing to try and understand how people are accessing food during lockdown. And specifically, we've been interested to try and understand the extent to which people have been struggling to secure the food that they need to feed their families. And we do that by trying to understand what we call food insecurity. And that's measured by asking about a fixed period of time, so usually the last month, and asking whether people have skipped meals or not eaten when they were hungry or not eaten for a whole day as a result of specifically not being able to afford enough food or not being able to get hold of the food that they need. So we asked those questions 7 weeks into lockdown about the previous month. So this really relates to the second half of the lockdown period. And we see that about 9% of households, 9.3% of households are experiencing some form of food insecurity, so one or more of those three measures. And that amounts to about 4.9 million adults and 1.7 million children living in those households. And those levels are about 2.5 times higher than pre-COVID. I mean, we've had a food insecurity problem now for a number of years, but the COVID crisis has really hugely escalated that problem. And there are a few reasons for that. Obviously, there's huge economic pressure on households. Our data shows that 30% of households have experienced a loss in income as a result of the crisis. And shortages of food was something that hit households in the first wave of lockdown, not less relevant in this data set. But also isolation and the concern, the physical problems of actually securing a delivery slot or securing help with shopping if you are not going out of your home. And isolation actually remains a risk factor for food insecurity, has been remaining throughout the crisis so far. So the situation's very serious and affecting children directly. We did ask people whether they've managed to secure any help, those that were reporting food insecurity, and more than half of them had said they'd received no offers of help. And many of them were very reluctant to go and ask for help because they said they would feel bad doing so, or didn't want to, or didn't know where to go for help. So I think it's true to say that we not only have a fairly major food insecurity crisis, but we've also got a situation where many people are suffering in silence behind closed doors without the help they need. Having said that, we know that we see evidence in our data that the scaling up of food parcels, which has been done on a huge scale in many local authorities, is really reaching people. And in fact, people who are isolating have got quite a high dependence on those food parcels, and many of them are relying on neighbours and friends and volunteers to do shopping. So we're seeing the positive effects of those interventions. We're delving into our data now to understand whether some of the economic programs which the government has put in place, particularly those to support people on universal credit, are making a dent into food insecurity. But I think even if they are, our evidence suggests that there are many people who are not benefiting enough to protect them from this type of really severe material deprivation. I think one final point is that we've been also looking particularly at whether children entitled to free school meals are getting the substitutes which the government has put in place in the form of vouchers and some in-kind food schemes that schools are running. And we're seeing in our data that still a significant proportion, about close to 22% of children entitled to free school meals, are not securing these substitutes. So that programme is good in that it's really reaching a large number of children, but there are a significant number that are still falling through the cracks. And as we embark on the long summer holiday period later next month, and at the moment with no commitment from the government in England to extend the voucher scheme over the summer holidays, many of those households are going to be really concerned about securing sufficient food for their children over that summer period before schools return in September.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a very fascinating but deeply worrying, I guess, set of findings that you have. And I wonder what you think that we can be doing as a country to provide people facing food insecurity with more support.
Yeah, I mean, so I think we need to be thinking about a few things. I think first of all, we need a common understanding across central government, local authorities and civil society groups about the scale of the need, and also therefore about which parts of government, civil society and local authorities are responsible for addressing that need. Currently, people are signposted to their local authorities from the central government website if they're having trouble with food. However, of course, to deal with some of these economic barriers to access to food, the most efficient ways of doing that are not by delivering a food parcel at a local authority level, but by channeling funding through the social security programme. So and the Department for Work and Pensions. So in the first instance, we think there needs to be a common understanding of what that need is, and then really making sure that we're using the most efficient routes to give people access to food. And I think our data shows that people are not going to go out looking for that help in many instances. There's a heavy stigma associated with food insecurity, which is another reason why ensuring that people have the money that they need to buy the food they need is the best way to go. In addition to that, I think there is a longer term role for local authorities to particularly help those who are isolating. And we can expect with the track and trace programme scaling up and with large numbers of people who are experiencing underlying health conditions and going to be really reluctant to leave their homes and break their isolation. We're going to need, for the foreseeable future, a situation where local authorities are and charities are supporting those people to get the food they need. So resourcing local authorities adequately for the medium term for their food response is going to be really important. And I know many local authorities are worried about the sustainability of their funding in that area. I think those are kind of the key areas. There remain a lot of things that we can do to support children, using both schools and the nursery system, and making sure that children, when they are in school or in nursery, are getting a healthy meal. And at the moment, we went into this crisis with lots of holes in our policy implementation around children's food, and they desperately need to be plugged.
Yeah, that's my next point as well, actually, that obviously coronavirus has deepened some of the struggles that families are facing, but food insecurity was a massive problem even before we went into lockdown. And I wonder if you could give us some insight as to why it's such a huge problem and why it has been such a huge problem in Britain.
Well, I mean, there are many reasons. The obvious ones are relating to low wages and social security, a set of safety nets which at the moment have too many holes in them, and just don't provide, in all instances, sufficient resource for people to afford a healthy diet. And families are making really tough choices between paying the electricity bill or buying shoes for their children and being able to afford a healthy meal. You know, we also, when we think about, you know, accessing healthy food, there are a ton of other reasons why people struggle to do that might go beyond money in their pockets, and relating to the sort of broader food environment, the heavy promotion of unhealthy foods, the extent to which high streets in some deprived parts of the country are dominated by unhealthy fast food. There's a whole raft of reasons why people might struggle to put a healthy meal on the table, but the economic reasons are particularly important, and we see from talking to children and young people, and also from survey data, that those problems have become worse.
Mm-hmm. And for those families who are really worried about food and struggling to put food on the table, what would your advice be for them, and the best way that they can find and seek out the support they need?
Well, I think in the first instance, I would be encouraging them to ask the local authority for help. Local authorities are signposting people. They have many of their own programs, but not be afraid to ask for help, because there are many people in their circumstances, and they shouldn't feel worried about asking for help if they need it. I think, secondly, I think if there are assuming that people have got time and have some reasonable cooking facilities at home, there's a huge amount of guidance online for how you can put a reasonably healthy meal together on a very low budget. I'm not presupposing that that is easy for many people. They might have problems with data getting online. You know, there might be multiple barriers that people face. But if that's a possible route, that is a good source of advice. And I think the other things are to really make sure that they're getting everything that they're entitled to. So make sure that they're asking the school about free school meal provision and getting vouchers or alternative substitutes for their kids. If they've got young children, making sure, seeing whether they're entitled to the Healthy Start programme, which is a national programme for children under the age of 4 and for pregnant women, to provide vouchers for food. So really make sure that they are seeking out every possible opportunity to secure the resources that they and their children might need. But I think in the first instance, don't be afraid to ask for help.
Anna, thank you so much for coming to speak to us. That was really fascinating. And if people want to find out more about what you and the Food Foundation do, is there a place they can go?
Yeah, well, I mean, our front page of our website channels you right through to all of the information we've got on food insecurity and our COVID tracker. So foodfoundation.org.uk is the website.
Perfect. And I'll put that in the description for anyone listening who wants to find out more about the Food Foundation. Thank you so much.
Lovely. Thank you.
And now we're going to go over to speak to Aoife, who works with me at Hubbub. Thanks for joining us, Aoife.
My pleasure.
So I know that we were talking a little bit in the presentations about some polling that we did at Hubbub, and in particular how different people have found food in the UK and what the picture is looking like for people at the moment. And I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of a rundown.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think in the first week of April or the last week of March, perhaps, we realised pretty quickly that there was a seismic shift going on in people's attitudes and relationship to food in the UK. So we put some polling to field. Around 2,000 people were polled across the UK on how they were experiencing food and accessing food at that moment, as lockdown was really kind of starting to kick in. We wanted to take a snapshot because for the first time since the Second World War, we realised that the general public was seeing shortages of staples, and some households were really struggling to access the food that they needed. So one of the first questions we asked in our polling was, have you seen any changes in your cooking and eating habits under lockdown? And 90% of people said that they had.
Wow.
Which is pretty whopper when you consider it's a really unusual event that would ever cause 90% of people to report a sudden change in any of their kind of fundamental habits. So yeah, a fascinating insight in itself that so many people had undergone kind of quick and dramatic change. So the main insight that we came up with, I suppose, from the polling was that people were having a really, really divided experience across the UK. On one hand, we were witnessing a lot of what David spoke to as well, around people perhaps valuing food a bit more and wasting less. So we had 57% of people saying that they were valuing their food more, and half of people reported that they were wasting less than usual, which is a pretty massive shift. Around half of people also said that they were eating more as a family or as a household during lockdown. People said they were enjoying their food more, and around 30% said that they were getting their children more involved in cooking, which under normal circumstances we'd consider to be a really, really positive thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and around a third said that they were seeing lockdown as an opportunity to improve their own cooking skills, which again, under normal circumstances, we'd see as a real positive. But then for every household, I suppose, that were kind of dusting off the baking tins or the cookbooks, it almost seemed like there was another household going through an awful lot of stress in relation to food. So we asked some questions around fears around food or worries around food, and we found that it's become an unprecedented cause for concern for a lot of people. So 45% of people overall were more worried than usual about food. Around the same number were worried about the cost of putting food on the table in particular, which is quite alarming really, because it's a fairly fundamental input into people's daily lives. Around the same number of people were worried about accessing just the staples. They were, worried about shortages of staples, which again is something that hasn't been seen in quite a few generations in the UK. So I suppose those statistics really, for me, illustrate that this crisis has gotten into the national psyche. The fear of food shortages is a really fundamental human fear, and it seemed to be playing out when we did that polling in a really, really big way. We also found something quite interesting, which was that 25% of people were finding additional meal preparation to be exhausting. And when you yeah, I know. And I think that rose to about 40% for younger age categories, say 16 to 24, 25. I think what's quite interesting there is that we're not used to having all of our meals at home. Most of us are used to doing about a third of our meals out of home. That's not fancy dinners necessarily. It's lunch on the go with school meals, etc. So having those additional meals to prepare is putting a huge toll on a lot of households. And to be honest, Sarah, I'd be super interested to hear whether that statistic has increased since that first or second week in April, because we're now 2 months into lockdown and a lot of people are probably feeling the burden of,
3 meals
more
a day.
housework, 3 meals a day, childcare, keeping up with school, keeping up with work. So yeah, I think it's in summary on that theme, we can definitely say that food has become quite a stress. Looking at people's shopping habits, a lot of this kind of would echo what David told us, which is we found that a lot of people are, more than half of people have used a shopping alternative to supermarkets for the first time since the restrictions were introduced. So that might be using your butcher more frequently or for the first time, getting a fruit or veg box delivery, a farm shop like David's, lots of people were reaching out to those. Some people were getting milk delivery for the first time, or just using a local greengrocer. And the really interesting piece for the smaller producers and for the high street actually is that the majority of people, about 90%, said they'll continue to use at least one of those new alternatives once the restrictions have ended. So that's a really interesting insight that came out. And again, like you say, it'll be super interesting to see what happens when people return to their busy normal lives and whether they can kind of follow through on that ambition to continue to support smaller local businesses. Sorry, go ahead.
No, if you've got more to say, please go on. I can ask you at the end.
I think that's kind of, they're the main insights that we pulled out of the polling. There's plenty more to it, and they're on the Hubbub website if anybody's interested to have a look. But I suppose just, even though it's been a really, really difficult period for most people and lots of people are very concerned about food, we have found that some people have made changes that can definitely be taken beyond the lockdown period and that are quite positive. So using their freezer more, using up what's at home, doing more meal planning or eating their leftovers. And to be honest, Sarah, like these are really handy ways to reduce your food waste, to reduce your environmental impact, but actually also to reduce your household budget. And if we're heading into a recession, it could be really, really useful for people to continue those new habits and practices.
Absolutely. And on the point you mentioned about people being exhausted by meal preparation, which I can absolutely see, especially if you've got more people at home than you're used to having at home. Are there any practical ways that people might be able to remove some of the burden from cooking and make it easier for them to run a household without all of the extra stress?
Yeah, so some of those practices or habits, I suppose, that I mentioned around using leftovers more and meal planning and using your freezer, they're all really, really useful practices to get into if you're trying to reduce your time in the kitchen and reduce the stress of being in the kitchen. So one really practical tip is if you're going to cook double or triple what you need for the next meal, and then package up the rest and pop it into the freezer just with a quick note written in permanent marker on the packaging as to what you've prepared, so it doesn't kind of go into the freezer abyss and never resurface
Never
again.
return.
Yeah, and then there's quite quick and cheap and easy ways to bulk out meals. So say if you make a chili with your usual recipe, put in 2 or 3 tins of black beans to really bulk that out and make more out of it. So really using something cheap and accessible and essentially that's been pre-cooked to bulk out your typical dishes is another really great way to just make more of what you have at home and cut down on yet another meal being prepared later in the week. We've got batch cooking tips on our website that are really helpful for kind of thinking about getting a bunch of ingredients and turning it into 2 or 3 different meals. And a really key thing as well is just using up leftovers. I've got a bit of a philosophy at home that almost anything can be eaten the next day if you put a fried egg on top of it. I don't know if everybody would agree with that.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I'm with you 100%.
So, you know, put whatever you had the day before, see is there a way to just bring it back to life a little bit, chop a few herbs or scallions, pop it on top. If it's something that can be reheated and served on toast, that can often be a good solution. But I think just getting creative with leftovers, being happy to kind of heat up and heat up to a good high temperature and then eat again what you've prepared the day before is a great way to cut down on that kind of quite tiring cooking. And I think whether you're a keen cook or not, nobody wants to be in the kitchen half the day every day. There are other things to be doing with life as well.
Yeah. That's other stuff you're getting on with. And my last question is just about what you think might change as we come out of lockdown. Is there anything that you're particularly keeping your eye on in terms of how we cook, how we shop, or how the systems might change entirely?
That's a really good question, and it's a really interesting moment in time. And I think anybody who works in food or has a keen eye for food systems is watching this moment really closely. So something that I think has come out as a really clear call for change is around shortening our food chains, buying more local and using a broader and more diverse range of sources of food. So the supermarkets have done an astonishing job of keeping the country fed through this really difficult time, and we're super grateful to them. But there is a lot to be said for a more diverse kind of range of food providers. So we've spoken a lot in the event on Thursday and in general just about the need for more localized food systems and food systems that are more resilient to shock. So if we rely solely on supermarkets for our food, they depend generally on very, very long, complex international chains. So I think through necessity, a lot of people have started using smaller local food producers and realize now the value to them. And
Definitely.
I think a blend of kind of the systems that we're quite used to, the supermarkets, which are fantastic in terms of low prices and have enormous variety of foodstuffs, using a mix of that system and then kind of really working hard now to support more local food producers is a model that could really see us through the next period.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming to speak to us. And if people want to find out more about either the food work Hubbub have been doing or to get some of the tips you mentioned, can they go to our website to get some info?
Absolutely. So hubbub.org.uk is packed with tips and information, and we've made a lot of it very tailored to the current situation.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for speaking to us.
No problem, my pleasure.